The autumn leaves danced outside the small art studio where Daniel Carter spent most of his evenings, paintbrush in hand and dreams filling his heart. At 23, he was all passion and no mania combination that made his landlord nervous, but his art luminous. His paintings spoke of hope, of love, of a future he couldn't quite afford but desperately wanted to build. "You're going to be late again," Emily Ross called from the doorway, her voice carrying both affection and gentle scolding. She stepped into the cramped space, careful not to knock over any canvases, her brown hair catching the warm light from his work lamp. Emily worked at the local library, earning just enough to support herself in a tiny apartment above the bookstore. But when she smiled at Daniel's latest creation, a portrait of their favorite spot by the River Mooney, seemed irrelevant. "It's almost finished," Daniel said, setting down his brush and pulling her into his arms. Paint stains decorated his shirt, and his hands smelled of turpentine. But Emily had long ago stopped caring about such details. "What do you think?" She studied the painting, seeing not just the technical skill, but the emotion he'd poured into every brushstroke. "Think you're going to change the world someday," she whispered against his chest. They had met 18 months. Earlier at a gallery opening, one of those pretentious events where Emily felt completely out of place until she found Daniel hiding in the corner, making sarcastic comments about the overpriced abstract pieces. They'd talked until the gallery closed, then continued their conversation at an all-night diner, sharing coffee and stories until dawn painted the sky. Their love grew quietly, but steadily, built on shared dreams and genuine understanding. Daniel would read to her from art books, while she prepared simple dinners in his studio. Emily would tell him about the books she discovered at the library, her eyes lighting up as she described characters who felt as real as friends. They were young and broke and completely happy, but happiness, Daniel was learning, didn't pay rent or buy groceries or fund art supplies. His landlord had started leaving increasingly urgent notes, and his part-time job at the frame shop barely covered his basic needs. The stack of rejection letters from galleries grew thicker each week. "Maybe I should get a real job," Daniel said one evening as they walked hand in hand through downtown. The streetlights cast long shadows, and Emily could see the worry lines forming around his eyes. "Your art is real," she replied firmly. "You just need time." "Time is what I'm running out of," he admitted. "Mr. Peterson wants me out by the end of the month if I can't catch up on rent." Emily squeezed his hand tighter. She'd been thinking about this moment for weeks, dreading it but knowing it was coming. "What about that job offer in Singapore? The one from your college friend Marcus?" Daniel stopped walking. Marcus had written 3 weeks ago about a position at an advertising firm, good money, stable work, a chance to use his artistic skills in a commercial setting. It was everything Daniel needed, except it was 8,000 miles away from Emily. "That would mean leaving you," he said quietly. "Maybe not forever," Emily replied, though her voice wavered. "Maybe just until you save enough to come back and open your own gallery." They both knew it wasn't that simple. Singapore wasn't a weekend trip away. It was another world, another life, another future entirely. But Daniel's savings account had exactly $47, and his credit card was maxed out. His art, beautiful as it was, hadn't sold a single piece in 6 months. That night, they sat on the roof of Emily's building, looking out over their small city. The lights twinkled below them like stars, and Daniel tried to memorize everything the way Emily's hair moved in the breeze, the sound of her laugh, the feeling of her hand in his. "If I go," he said finally, "will you wait for me?" Emily turned to face him, tears already forming in her eyes. "I'll write every day," she promised. "When you come back." "When I come back," Daniel interrupted, "I'm going to marry you. I'm going to give you everything you deserve." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, one he'd been carrying for weeks, saving every penny to buy. Inside was a simple silver ring with a tiny diamond, nothing fancy but chosen, with all the love his young heart could hold. "I can't ask you to marry me now," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Not when I can't even provide for myself. But someday, when I'm successful, when I can give you the life you deserve." Emily pressed her finger to his lips, silencing him. "Keep it," she whispered. "Bring it back to me when you're ready." 3 weeks later, Daniel stood at the airport gate, holding a one-way ticket to Singapore. Emily was there to see him off, trying to smile through her tears. They held each other until the final boarding call, making promises they both hoped they could keep. "I love you," Daniel said as he finally let go. "Come back to me," Emily whispered, as his plane lifted off into the night sky. Neither of them could have imagined that 22 years would pass before they saw each other again. 4. The first 6 months, their love survived on handwritten letters and expensive international phone calls. Daniel's words painted pictures of bustling Singapore streets, towering skyscrapers, and the advertising world that was slowly but surely recognizing his talent. Emily's responses carried the scent of home updates about mutual friends, descriptions of the changing seasons, and always, always, the promise that she was waiting. "Dear Emily," Daniel wrote on a humid Tuesday evening from his tiny apartment overlooking Chinatown. "Singapore is incredible, but incredibly lonely without you. I got promoted today. They want me to lead the creative team for a major campaign. The pay increase means I might be able to visit for Christmas. Keep December 23rd free. I'm going to surprise you." But December 23rd came and went without Daniel. Miscommunication at the post office meant Emily never received his letter about the promotion. Instead, she received one dated 3 weeks later. "Dear Emily, I'm sorry I couldn't make it home for Christmas. Work has been insane, and I couldn't get time off. I hope you understand." Emily read the letter sitting in the same cafe where she'd once spent hours talking with Daniel. Snow fell outside the windows, and she wondered if Singapore had snow, if Daniel missed the white winters of home. She wrote back immediately, but her letter filled with hurt and confusion crossed paths with another of Daniel's, this one, explaining about the promotion and his failed travel plans. The gap between their realities began to widen. Daniel threw himself into work with desperate intensity. Success in Singapore came faster than he'd expected. His campaigns were winning awards. His salary was climbing, and within 2 years he'd saved enough money to start thinking about returning home. But when he called Emily's number on their second anniversary apart, a recording told him the number was no longer in service. Panic seized him. Tried the library where Emily worked, only to learn she'd left 6 months earlier. Her landlord said she'd moved out suddenly, leaving no forwarding address. Friends had scattered, moved on with their lives. Daniel found himself grasping at shadows. Emily, meanwhile, was dealing with her own crisis. Her mother had suffered a stroke, requiring Emily to move back to the family farm 2 hours outside the city to become her caregiver. The rural area had no reliable phone service, and the post office was a 30-minute drive away. Letters that once flowed regularly between them began to stack up in the city apartment Emily had vacated. Eventually being returned to Singapore, marked addressee unknown. "Where are you, Daniel?" Emily would whisper to herself during the long nights when her mother's condition seemed especially fragile. She'd written dozens of letters to his Singapore address, but none were answered. She had no way of knowing that Daniel had moved to a bigger apartment across the city, or that the forwarding service at his old building had expired in Singapore. Daniel stared at his returned letters, Emily's handwriting on envelopes stamped with red rejection marks. Addressee unknown. The words felt like a knife through his heart. Had she moved on? Found someone else? The questions tormented him as he worked 18-hour days, building the advertising empire that would eventually make him a millionaire. "You need to let go," his friend Marcus said one evening as they shared drinks on a rooftop bar overlooking the Singapore skyline. "It's been for years, Daniel. If she wanted to find you, she would have." Daniel fingered the small velvet box in his pocket, the same ring he'd shown Emily that night on the rooftop. He'd carried it everywhere, a talisman of a promise he was desperate to keep. But Marcus was right, for years of silence spoke louder than any words. Emily's mother passed away when Emily was 28, leaving her alone on a farm that held too many memories and not enough hope. She sold the property and moved to a small college town where she'd been offered a position teaching literature. It was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild a life that had been on hold for 6 years. On quiet evenings in her new apartment, Emily would sometimes take out the box of letters Daniel had sent from Singapore, 47 of them. Each one read so many times the paper had grown soft with handling. His last letter, postmarked 7 years ago, still spoke of coming home to her. She wondered if he'd ever made it back, if he'd looked for her, if he'd found someone else to love. Daniel did return home finally, after 12 years in Singapore. By then, he was wealthy beyond his youthful dreams. His advertising firm had expanded internationally, and smart investments had multiplied his success. But the city he returned to felt foreign. The art studio where he'd once dreamed of the future had been demolished and replaced by a parking garage. Emily's old apartment building still stood, but new tenants occupied every familiar space. He spent weeks retracing their old haunts, hoping for a glimpse of brown hair and a warm smile. The library had been renovated, the cafe where they'd shared countless conversations was now a cell phone store. Even the rooftop where he'd promised to return with a ring had been converted into exclusive condominiums. She's gone, Daniel finally admitted to himself, standing in the spot where his art studio used to be. The city had moved on, just as Emily apparently had, bought a mansion in the hills, filled it with expensive art and empty rooms, and tried to convince himself that success was enough. But every night before sleep, he would take out the ring and remember a promise made under starlight, when love seemed strong enough to survive anything. 22 years after leaving, 15 years after their last communication, Daniel Carter was a millionaire who owned everything except the one thing that mattered most. Somewhere across the state, Emily Ross was grading papers in her small apartment, occasionally glancing at a framed photo on her desk, a young man with paint-stained fingers and dreams in his eyes, frozen forever in the amber of memory. Neither knew that fate was already preparing their reunion, that a simple rainstorm on an ordinary Tuesday would bring their lost love full circle. The rain began as Daniel Carter stepped out of his black Mercedes in downtown Millbrook, the same city where he'd once been a struggling artist with $47 to his name. Now, at 45, his custom-tailored suit cost more than he used to make in 3 months. But wealth felt like a hollow achievement as he walked streets he'd once known by heart. He'd returned to oversee the opening of his company's new regional office. Carter Creative had grown into an international advertising powerhouse, and Millbrook was expanding rapidly enough to warrant his personal attention. But if Daniel was honest with himself, business wasn't the only reason he'd come back. After 22 years, he still found himself searching familiar faces for one that had never left his dreams. The downpour caught him unprepared. Despite his wealth and success, Daniel had forgotten an umbrella, small oversight that felt absurdly symbolic as he ducked into the nearest shelter. A small cafe called Chapter and Verse nestled between a bookstore and a flower shop. The warm air carried the scent of coffee and old books, instantly transporting him back to evenings when he and Emily would spend hours talking about art and literature. Shaking rainwater from his jacket, Daniel surveyed the cozy interior. Mismatched chairs surrounded wooden tables scarred with the rings of countless coffee cups. Bookshelves lined the walls, and soft jazz played from hidden speakers. It was the kind of place that prioritized comfort over profit, atmosphere over efficiency, and there, sitting at a corner table with a stack of papers and a red pen, was Emily Ross. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. 22 years had passed, but he would have recognized her anywhere. Her brown hair, now touched with silver at the temples, was pulled back in the same loose bun she used to wear while reading. Laugh lines had joined the freckles on her cheeks, and reading glasses perched on her nose, but her posture slightly hunched over her work, completely absorbed, was exactly as he remembered. She looked up as another customer entered, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on Daniel. My moment time stopped completely. Her red pen slipped from fingers that had suddenly gone numb, and her eyes widened with a mixture of shock and something Daniel desperately hoped was joy. Double quotes, Daniel. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the quiet cafe, it carried like a bell. Hello, Emily. His own voice sounded strange to his ears, rougher than he'd intended. Filled with 22 years of suppressed longing, she stood slowly, as if moving through water, her papers forgotten. She was wearing a simple blue sweater and dark jeans, an outfit that probably cost less than Daniel's tie. But she looked more beautiful than any of the sophisticated women who'd graced his arm at various galas and business functions over the years. You came back, she said, and Daniel heard a dozen questions in those 3 words. I did. He took a tentative step closer, afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly. You look exactly the same. Emily laughed, a sound that sent warmth through Daniel's chest. Liar. I look like a middle-aged teacher who forgot her umbrella and got caught in the rain yesterday. You look perfect, Daniel said, and meant it completely. They stood there for several heartbeats, too middle-aged. People rediscovering the rhythm of a conversation that had been interrupted for more than 2 decades. Other customers continued their quiet chatter around them, but Daniel felt as if he and Emily existed in a bubble outside normal time. Would you, ... Could I buy you coffee? Daniel asked, gesturing toward the empty chair across from her table. Unless you're working. I don't want to interrupt. I'm grading freshman essays on Pride and Prejudice, Emily said, gathering her papers into a neat stack. Trust me, you'd be saving me from reading another analysis of how Elizabeth Bennet is just being dramatic about Wickham. Daniel smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. Still teaching literature? 15 years now at Millbrook Community College. Emily sat back down, and Daniel took the chair across from her, marveling at how natural it felt despite the impossible gulf of years between them. He looked successful. A simple observation carried no judgment. But Daniel felt suddenly self-conscious about his expensive suit, his manicured hands, the Rolex on his wrist that cost more than most. People's cars? I did well for myself in Singapore, started my own company. Advertising. Emily remembered, and Daniel's heart skipped. Yes, we have offices in 12 countries now. Paused, realizing how that sounded. But I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot ... I never forgot you. Emily's cheeks flushed slightly. Daniel, I looked for you, he said urgently, needing her to understand. When I came back the first time, 15 years ago, I searched everywhere. Your apartment was empty. The library said you'd left. Nobody knew where you'd gone. My mother was sick, Emily said quietly. I had to move back to the farm to take care of her. By the time she passed, years had gone by, and I assumed you'd moved on with your life. Never, Daniel said firmly. Not once, not ever. The cafe owner, an elderly woman with kind eyes, approached their table. Sorry to interrupt, but we're closing in about an hour. Can I get you folks? Anything else? Daniel looked at Emily, suddenly desperate not to let her disappear again. Would you... Do you have dinner plans? There's so much I want to know, so much I want to tell you. Emily glanced at her stack of ungraded papers, then back at Daniel's hopeful face. Those essays aren't going anywhere, she said with a smile. That made Daniel feel 23 again. And I have to admit I'm curious about what happened to that passionate young artist I used to know. He never really left, Daniel said softly. He just got buried under a lot of expensive suits and board meetings. They gathered their things and prepared to leave the cafe. Daniel realized his hands were shaking slightly.
22 years.
Of success, of building an empire, of accumulating wealth beyond his wildest dreams. None of it had prepared him for the simple terror and joy of sitting across from Emily Ross again. The rain was still falling when they stepped outside. Neither of them seemed to mind getting wet. They chose Giovanni's, the same Italian restaurant where they'd celebrated Daniel's first and only gallery showing 23 years earlier. The interior had been updated with modern fixtures and a fresh coat of paint, but the corner booth, where they'd once shared cheap wine and expensive dreams, was still there, almost as if it had been waiting for their return. I can't believe this place is still here, Emily said, sliding into the familiar red vinyl seat. The years fell away as she traced the small heart Daniel had carved into the table edge during one particularly romantic evening. Daniel said quietly, settling across from her. 3 years ago when I heard it was going to be demolished. The owner was retiring, and developers wanted to put up condos. Emily stared at him in amazement. You bought an entire restaurant? I couldn't let them tear down our memories, Daniel admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. The manager doesn't know. I set up a trust to run it anonymously. I just wanted to make sure it stayed exactly as it was. The gesture was so thoughtful, so deeply romantic, that Emily felt tears prick her eyes. Daniel, ... Tell me about your life, he said, desperate to change the subject before emotion overwhelmed him completely. What happened after I left? Emily sipped her wine, a much better vintage than they'd been able to afford in their youth, and began to speak. She told him about her mother's stroke, about the years on the farm feeling like her life was on hold while everyone else moved forward. She described the loneliness of watching friends marry and have children while she remained frozen in time. Unable to move on, but unable to go back. "I dated," she said, seeing the question in Daniel's eyes. "Nothing serious for the first few years. I kept thinking you'd come back. But eventually, I tried to build something with other people." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain quiet. "There was Robert, the high school English teacher. We dated for 3 years. Sweet man, very stable, everything that made sense on paper." Emily smiled sadly. "He proposed twice. I said no both times, and I could never explain why. It wasn't fair to him, and after that, a few shorter relationships. Coffee dates that never went anywhere. Dinner companions who were perfectly nice but never... double quotes." She paused, searching for words. "Never you." Daniel reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His skin was softer now, more paint stains or calluses from stretching canvases. But his touch still sent electricity through her entire body. "I tried to find someone too," he said. "Singapore is full of beautiful, successful women. I dated executives, artists, diplomats. There was Carol Ann. We were together for 2 years. She was brilliant, accomplished, everything anyone would want in a partner. What happened? She asked me once why I always seemed to be waiting for someone else to walk through the door," Daniel said. "I couldn't answer her, but I knew she was. Right, every woman I met, I compared to you. My every laugh, every conversation, every quiet moment, measured up to what we had. Their food arrived the same dishes they'd always ordered, as if their taste buds had been frozen in time. Along with their hearts? Daniel had pasta arrabbiata, Emily chose the mushroom risotto, and they shared tiramisu for dessert, just like always. "Tell me about your art," Emily said between bites. "Do you still paint?" Daniel's expression grew wistful. "I have a studio in my house, biggest, most well-equipped art space money can buy. But I haven't touched a brush in 5 years. Every time I try to paint, all I create are memories of you." He pulled out his phone and showed her photos from his home studio. Canvases lined the walls, dozens of them, all depicting familiar scenes. The river where they used to walk, Emily reading in the park, the view from her old rooftop. 22 years of longing translated into oil and acrylic. "You kept painting me," Emily whispered. "Tears flowing freely now. I never stopped loving you," Daniel said simply. Success, money, travel, other relationships, none of it mattered, because the most important part of me was still here, still, waiting for you. Emily set down her fork, overwhelmed by the intensity of emotion at their small table. "I never married," she said quietly. "Everyone always asked why, and I had a dozen reasonable answers. Focused on my career, hadn't met the right person, enjoying my independence. But the truth was, I was already married in my heart. To a memory, to a promise, to a boy with paint on his hands who flew to Singapore and never came back." "I did come back," Daniel said urgently. 15 years ago, I came back with enough money to take care of both of us, to give you everything I'd promised. But you were gone, and nobody knew where to find you. We were like ships passing in the night," Emily said sadly, "always missing each other by months or miles." Daniel pulled out his wallet and removed something Emily hadn't seen in over 2 decades, a small velvet box, worn smooth by years of being carried in pockets and briefcases and suitcases around the world. "You kept it," Emily breathed. "I've carried this ring for 22 years, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Through 12 countries, 100 business trips, 1,000 lonely nights. It never felt right to give it to anyone else, because it was never meant for anyone else." Emily touched the box with trembling fingers. Daniel... "I know we're not 23 anymore," he said quickly. "I know too much time has passed, too. Much has happened. We're different people now. But Emily, some things don't change. The way you smile when you're really happy, the way you tuck your hair behind your ear when you're thinking, the way my heart stops when you say my name." They sat in silence for several minutes, hands linked across the table. to middle-aged people rediscovering a love that had never really died. Around them, the restaurant hummed with conversation and clinking glasses, but they existed in their own private universe. "What happens now?" Emily asked eventually. Daniel squeezed her hand. "I don't know," he admitted. "All I know is that I spent 22 years building a life without you, and it never felt like living. Seeing you today, sitting here with you now, this is the most alive I've felt since I left." Emily studied his face, seeing both the young artist she'd fallen in love with and the successful man he'd become. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Me too," Daniel said. "But I'm more scared of losing you again than I am of taking a chance on us."
Yes.
They left the restaurant that night, walking slowly through streets now familiar to both of them again. Neither spoke about the future, but both felt the weight of possibility, the dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, some love stories were strong enough to survive 22 years of separation. The ring remained in Daniel's pocket, but not for much longer. 3 weeks passed in a blur of rediscovery. Daniel had extended his stay in Millbrook indefinitely, claiming his company needed his personal oversight of the new office. In reality, he couldn't bear the thought of leaving Emily again, not when they were so carefully rebuilding the trust and intimacy that distance had damaged. They fell into a gentle rhythm that felt both new and beautifully familiar. Morning coffee at Chapter and Verse, where Emily graded papers while Daniel worked on his laptop, occasionally sharing glances over their respective tasks. Afternoon walks through Millbrook's historic district, exploring changes that had occurred. During their separation, quiet dinners at Giovanni's or simple meals Daniel would cook in Emily's modest apartment, their conversation flowing as easily as it had 2 decades earlier. "You know," Emily said one evening as Daniel prepared his signature, pasta dish in her tiny kitchen, "I keep expecting to wake up and find this was all a dream." Daniel paused in his stirring to look at her. She was curled up on her couch, grading yet another stack of essays, her reading glasses sliding down her nose in the endearing way that made his heart skip. "If it's a dream, I hope I never wake up." Emily had been thinking constantly about Daniel's unspoken proposal, about the ring he carried everywhere, but had yet to offer again. She could see the questions in his eyes during quiet moments, could feel his careful restraint as he waited for some sign from her about what she wanted their future to look like. The truth was, Emily was terrified. 22 years was a long time, long enough for people to become strangers to themselves, let alone to each other. But every day with Daniel felt like coming home to herself, like stepping back into a life she'd abandoned rather than lost. "I've been thinking," she said, carefully setting down her red pen, "about what you said at the restaurant, about not being the same people we were." Daniel's hand stilled on the wooden spoon, and, "You're right, we're not 23 anymore, we're better." Emily stood and walked to the kitchen, leaning against the counter so she could look directly at him. "That boy I fell in love with was passionate and sweet, but he was also scared and uncertain. This man," she reached out to touch Daniel's face gently, "this man fought for his dreams and won. This man spent 22 years carrying a promise. This man bought an entire restaurant to preserve our memories." Daniel turned off the burner and gave Emily his full attention. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want to keep living in the past, afraid of the future. I'm saying yes, Daniel, to whatever question you're afraid to ask, to whatever life you want to build together." "Yes." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "Emily, ask me," she whispered. "Ask me properly this time." Daniel's hands were shaking as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn velvet box. 22 years of hoping, of dreaming, imagining this moment had led to this. Emily's small kitchen, the scent of garlic and tomatoes in the air. Rain beginning to tap against the windows. But as Daniel dropped to one knee on Emily's linoleum floor, the modest setting felt more romantic than any grand gesture could have been. This was real life, their life, imperfect and beautiful, and finally within reach. "Emily Ross," Daniel said, his voice cracking with emotion. 22 years ago, I promised to come back to you. I promised to become successful enough to give you everything you deserved. I kept half that promise. I did become successful, more than I ever dreamed possible. But the other half, he opened the box, revealing the same simple ring he'd chosen with a young man's careful savings. ... The other half was always about you. Emily's tears fell freely as Daniel continued, his words coming from a heart that had stored them for over 2 decades. I've had everything money can buy, but I've never had a single day of true happiness without you. You are my heart, my home, my reason for everything good I've ever accomplished. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that some promises are worth waiting for? Yes, Emily whispered, then louder. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled with joy rather than nervousness. It fit perfectly, as if those 22 years had been nothing more than a pause in their love story rather than an ending, as he stood and pulled her into his arms. Emily marveled at how right everything felt. The ring on her finger, Daniel's. Arms around her, the future stretching ahead of them, not the uncertain future of youth, but the confident future of 2 people who had learned what love was worth. I love you, Daniel murmured against her hair. I never stopped loving you. I know, Emily replied, pulling back to look at his face. And Daniel, that scared young artist I fell in love with? He's still there, in your eyes, in your heart. Success didn't change the parts of you that mattered most. Outside, the rain fell harder, drumming against the windows in a rhythm that sounded like celebration. Daniel and Emily stood in the warm glow of the kitchen light, holding each other close, finally understanding that the best love stories aren't about perfect timing. They're about perfect love finding its way home. 6 months later, they married in Giovanni's restaurant, surrounded by friends and family. With the carved heart in their old booth serving as their altar, Emily wore her grandmother's simple dress. Daniel wore a vintage vest he'd found in his old art supplies. The ceremony was small, intimate, and absolutely perfect. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife to the same song that had been playing on the radio, the night Daniel first showed her the ring, Emily rested her head against Daniel's shoulder and smiled. Was it worth the wait? She asked softly. Daniel tightened his arms around her, thinking of all the years of longing, all the success that had felt empty. All the nights he'd stared at the stars and wondered if love was strong enough to bridge. Any distance? Every single day? He whispered back. Every single day. And as they swayed together in the restaurant where their love had begun, both of them knew that some promises were indeed worth keeping, no matter how long they took to fulfill.